Good evening, Africa. Good evening across the globe, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters of Africa and beyond. Welcome to Talk for Africa 360. Tonight, I want you to pause not just with your ears, but with your heart, because what I am about to share is not just news. It is history in the making and history in the breaking. Picture this: a single moment when the world expected Africa to kneel, but instead Africa stood. A single moment when billions of dollars were waved before our eyes, but instead of signing away our future, one man said no. A moment when Africa chose courage over compromise, dignity over dependency, sovereignty over submission. Ibrahim, the young soldier who rose from the soil of Burkina Faso, was offered a $1 billion check by Walmart, the largest retail giant in the world. $1 billion. For some, that number would mean salvation. For others, it would mean surrender. But for him, it was neither. He knew the price was too high. Because the hidden cost behind that check was Africa's freedom, Africa's control, Africa's destiny. And so he refused. Now let me ask you, my people, when was the last time in our modern history that Africa said no, not to scraps, not to aid, not to loans, but to billions of dollars on the table? When was the last time Africa turned its back on the so-called kings of capitalism and declared, "We will build our own"? This is not just about retail. This is not just about supermarkets. This is about a revolution. Imagine walking into a store and every single product on the shelves comes from African hands: rice grown in Mali, shea butter from Burkina Faso, coffee roasted in Ethiopia, cocoa from Ghana, cassava flour from Nigeria, textiles from Senegal. Imagine paying for those goods and knowing that your money does not fly to New York, London, or Paris, but circulates right here in African towns, African villages, African cities. That, my friends, is not business. That is liberation. And that liberation began with refusal. A refusal that shocked the world. The West could not believe it. How dare Africa say no? How dare a leader turn down $1 billion? Who in their right mind refuses Walmart? But was not looking with the eyes of the West. He was looking with the eyes of Sankara, with the spirit of Nkrumah, with the heartbeat of Lumumba, with the dream of Mandela. He was looking at Africa through the lens of pride, not pity. Brothers and sisters, tonight, I want you to understand this is not a story of one man. This is a story of all of us. This is about every farmer who sells his crops for pennies because foreign companies set the price. This is about every young graduate who cannot find work because African economies are chained by outsiders. This is about every mother who shops for imported goods while her own neighbors produce rots in the field. This is about us reclaiming what is ours. And so, I ask you, are you ready to imagine a new Africa? Are you ready to believe in an Africa that builds, owns, and controls? Are you ready to walk into a supermarket and say with pride, "This is ours, this is African, this is the future"? If you are ready, then listen closely, because what began with one refusal has now become the foundation of Africa's largest retail empire, and the story of how it happened will shake not just Africa, but the entire world. Welcome to Talk for Africa 360. The revolution begins now. Brothers and sisters of Africa, sons and daughters of this sacred soil, hear me tonight with the fire of truth burning through these words, for what I am about to share is not just a story of business, not just a tale of commerce. It is a declaration of sovereignty, a rewriting of destiny, a rebirth of African dignity before the eyes of a trembling world. It began with a phone call, a whispered proposal carried from boardrooms in Bentonville, Arkansas, to the heart of Ouagadougou. Walmart, the so-called giant of global retail, the empire built on the exploitation of sweatshops and the destruction of small communities, came knocking at the doors of Africa. They came to Burkina Faso with their polished smiles, their promises of billions, their claims of partnership. They came with their usual weapons: capital, meant to buy silence, contracts meant to steal sovereignty, deals meant to enslave. And at the center of their grand design was Ibrahim, the young captain who had already shaken the foundations of neo-colonial power. "Name your price," they whispered. "We will give you $1 billion today. Sign away the vision of Africa's future. Let us own your markets. Let us dictate your shelves. Let us decide what your people eat, what they wear, how they live. Let Walmart become the ruler of African retail, and you will be remembered as the leader who brought modernity to your people." But did not bend. He did not tremble before their billions. He did not let the glitter of Western money blind him to the chains hidden within. He looked them in the eye and said words that will echo through history. "Africa is not for sale. Burkina Faso is not for auction. Our markets are not your playground. If the only thing you bring to us is ownership over our future, then you bring nothing at all. Take your $1 billion and leave. We will build our own." The world gasped. The so-called experts in Washington and Paris laughed at what they called foolishness. The financial press mocked him. How can a small landlocked country turn down such an offer? How can they compete with the might of Walmart? Who will shop in an African retail store when the Western giant dominates the globe? But in the villages of Burkina Faso, in the towns of Mali, in the cities of Niger, in the streets of Dakar, Lagos, and Nairobi, people rose to their feet, fists clenched, and shouted, "This is the Africa we have been waiting for. This is the leader who refuses to kneel." And from that refusal, from that single act of courage, a revolution was born. Called together not the bankers of Europe, not the shareholders of Wall Street, but the farmers, the traders, the artisans, the market women who have for centuries carried Africa's economy on their backs without recognition. He asked them a simple question: do you want to continue being slaves to their imports, or do you want to be the builders of Africa's future? Their answer was thunder. From the ground up, from the soil where cassava and millet grew, from the fields where African rice and maize thrived, from the workshops where leather was stitched and iron was forged, came a chorus: "We will build with you." And so it began the dream that the West said was impossible. An African retail empire, not built on exploitation, but on empowerment. Not imported from Europe, but rooted in Africa's soil. Not a copy of Walmart, but a vision greater, bolder, deeper, an empire that would rise to become Africa's largest, shaking the very foundations of global commerce. It started with one store, a single shining marketplace in Ouagadougou, designed not like a foreign supermarket with cold shelves and lifeless aisles, but as a living cathedral of African abundance. The floors carried the grains of Burkina Faso, the fruits of Ghana, the fabrics of Mali, the spices of Ethiopia, the fish of Senegal. Each product carried not just a price tag but stories of farmers free from middlemen, of artisans finally paid with dignity, of women entrepreneurs rising to feed their nations, and the people came, at first out of curiosity, then out of loyalty, then out of pride. They walked through doors that were not controlled by foreign brands, that did not mock their culture with imported plastic foods and genetically modified seeds. They came because for the first time they were shopping in a store that felt like home, a store that said, "You are African, and this is your house." Walmart watched with disbelief. The Western media sneered. It is a symbolic gesture. It will collapse in 6 months. But 6 months later, the store was thriving. A year later, there were 10. 2 years later, 50 across Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, by the 5th year. Vision had spread across West Africa, with branches rising in Lagos, Dakar, Accra, and Abidjan, and every store carried the same principle. Africa first, local farmers before foreign corporations, fair prices before exploitation, dignity before profit. Let us pause here, my brothers and sisters, to understand the magnitude of this act. When refused Walmart's billion-dollar offer, he was not just rejecting money, he was rejecting a future where Africa's shelves were filled with foreign goods, where African farmers remained beggars at the gates of Western supermarkets, where African workers remained trapped in low-wage exploitation. He was saying no to dependency, no to humiliation, no to the continuation of colonialism in another name. And in saying no, he gave us all a chance to say yes, yes to sovereignty, yes to self-sufficiency, yes to pride in our own hands. But make no mistake, the road was not easy. The West did not clap politely and walk away. They unleashed their fury. They tried to sabotage. They used their media to call African goods low quality. They used their financial institutions to block credit, their shipping companies to delay supplies, their governments to impose sudden restrictions on trade. They even whispered to some African leaders, "Stop this man. He is dangerous. He will make you believe you can survive without us." But the people would not be deceived. They knew what they were building. They knew the taste of freedom in every tomato grown locally, in every bag of rice that did not come from imported U.S. warehouses, in every fabric woven with African pride. They knew, and they defended it fiercely. And so, like a tree that grows stronger in the storm, the empire expanded. Not with foreign loans, but with African investment. Not with Western dependency, but with Pan-African cooperation. Farmers who had once struggled to sell their crops suddenly found stable markets. Women who had once sold vegetables on the roadside now supplied entire districts. Young Africans who once dreamed only of leaving for Europe now dreamed of starting their own businesses, supplying products to Africa's largest retail empire. This, brothers and sisters, is how revolutions are built, not just with speeches, not just with flags, but with bread, with rice, with clothing, with every simple act of dignity in daily life. And what started as a refusal of $1 billion grew into an empire worth tens of billions, stretching across Africa, inspiring every nation to believe again. Tonight, I stand before you to remind you of this truth. It is not the size of the Western offer that determines our destiny. It is the size of our courage to refuse it. Showed us that Africa does not need to sell itself to be great. Africa only needs to believe in itself, to organize itself, to invest in itself. And when we do, the world will no longer ask, why did Africa refuse Walmart's billion? The world will ask, how did Africa build something so powerful that even Walmart trembles at its shadow? This is the beginning, my brothers and sisters. The seed has been planted, the empire is rising. And in the heart of every African child who sees an African store filled with African goods, a new belief is being born. We are enough, we are powerful, we are free. Ladies and gentlemen, the story of Ibrahim's refusal to sell Africa's dignity for $1 billion check did not end with defiance. No, it was only the beginning of a revolution that spread like wildfire from Ouagadougou to Lagos, from Dakar to Nairobi, from Bamako to Johannesburg. For in that decisive act, a seed was planted, a seed of retail sovereignty, of economic liberation, of African control over African markets. And when that seed took root, it blossomed into what today we call the United African Retail Network, the largest retail empire ever built on this continent, owned by Africa, for Africa. Let us be clear. The West thought Burkina Faso would never rise beyond its so-called limitations. They laughed when announced his vision. They scoffed when he told them that one day African farmers would not only grow food but see their produce stocked in shelves owned by African chains. They ridiculed him when he claimed that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger could design their own logistics networks and distribution systems without bowing to French or American corporations. They mocked, but they did not understand Africa had changed. The first challenge was scale. For decades, Western corporations had locked African farmers and producers out of their own markets. Multinationals dictated the prices of cocoa, cashews, rice, maize, palm oil, and soybeans. If an African farmer sold directly, their profit was crushed by foreign intermediaries. Western-owned supermarkets in Africa, from South Africa to Senegal, were filled with foreign brands, while local producers fought for crumbs. It was a system designed to keep Africa consuming but never owning, producing but never profiting. Yi's vision shattered that logic. With India's partnership, with China's infrastructure, with African labor and ingenuity, the first flagship stores were built not in capital cities for the elite, but in provincial towns for the people. In Bobo Dioulasso, in Zinder, in Timbuktu, in Tamale, places the West never cared to invest in. These stores were not just shops, they were symbols of independence. Every shelf carried African goods: yams from Ghana, shea butter from Burkina Faso, tea from Kenya, rice from Mali, textiles from Niger, and prices controlled not by foreign middlemen but by local cooperatives. It wasn't easy. Walmart tried sabotage. Carrefour lobbied European governments to sanction the empire. French banks refused to provide letters of credit. American shipping giants blocked access to cargo routes. But Africa did not bow. Instead, the lead network forged alliances with African logistics companies. New cargo ships were built in Djibouti and Mombasa. A Pan-African payment system was launched bypassing Visa and MasterCard, using a sovereign African digital currency pegged to gold. Had studied the game, and he was determined never to play by Western rules. And then came the moment that stunned the West. Within 3 years, the African retail empire controlled 40% of food distribution in West Africa. Farmers who once begged for survival now delivered directly to shelves. Women's cooperatives supplied shea butter in bulk to stores stretching from Accra to Bamako. Tailors in Niger sold garments proudly labeled made in Sahel in malls once dominated by imported French fashion. It was no longer about competition. It was about rewriting the rules. But what made this empire different was not just scale, it was ownership. Every store was co-owned by local communities, every profit reinvested into infrastructure, schools, and healthcare. Yi's model was radical. Instead of exporting Africa's wealth, it circled back into Africa's veins. That is why people called it not just a business, but a movement. Western media panicked. The Financial Times screamed about African protectionism. The Wall Street Journal warned that Western corporations were losing influence in Africa's consumer markets. Brussels called it economic nationalism. Washington labeled it a threat to free trade. But what they really feared was something far deeper. The day Africa would feed, clothe, and serve itself without permission from the West. And ladies and gentlemen, that day had arrived. Imagine the sight. Malls in Ouagadougou packed with African families buying African-made products. Children eating snacks produced by African food companies, not imported candy from Europe. Young men and women walking confidently in African-tailored fashion, not second-hand clothes dumped from abroad. Farmers receiving real money for their produce, not scraps. Doctors using African-made medical supplies sold in African stores. It was not just retail, it was Renaissance. Ibrahim did not merely refuse Walmart. He refused dependency. He refused submission. He refused the lie that Africa must always be the buyer, never the seller. Always the consumer, never the controller. And through that refusal, he built an empire that today employs millions, uplifts millions, and inspires billions. And yet, my brothers and sisters, this is only part of the story. Because as this empire grew, as it spread from West Africa to Central and Eastern Africa, new challenges arose. Western governments began to pressure African allies. Some leaders wavered. Some elites resisted change, clinging to their ties with Europe. Some tried to sabotage from within. But the people would not allow betrayal. For once they had tasted sovereignty, there was no going back. The African retail empire became a school of liberation. It taught Africans not just to shop differently, but to think differently. It taught them that ownership is power, and power is dignity. And so I say to you today, as this revolution continues, what we are witnessing is not just a business triumph. It is a political triumph. It is a spiritual triumph. It is Africa declaring, once and for all, that we are not for sale. By the time the African retail empire spread across 20 nations, it was no longer merely an alternative, it was the standard. From the rice markets of Mali to the coffee plantations of Ethiopia, from the cocoa fields of Côte d'Ivoire to the cotton farms of Burkina Faso, a single vision connected millions of producers with millions of consumers under one pan-African roof. The empire became a living organism. Stores were powered by solar grids built in Africa, staffed by African youth trained through vocational academies, and stocked with goods transported through Africa's own railway networks, many revived after decades of colonial neglect. It was no longer a dream. It was reality, but let us be honest, with triumph came backlash. Washington tightened sanctions. Brussels threatened tariffs on African exports. Paris funded misinformation campaigns, calling the empire unsustainable, and chaotic American business channels accused of closing Africa to free markets while conveniently ignoring centuries of Western monopoly. Yet the empire grew stronger. Why? Because it was rooted not in profit alone, but in sovereignty, solidarity, and sustainability. When Western corporations raised barriers, Africa built bridges within. When banks refused financing, African nations pooled gold reserves to back their own lending. When the IMF cried foul, Africans cried freedom, and let us not forget, the people themselves were the backbone. Mothers who once walked miles for imported powdered milk now had access to fresh African dairy in their neighborhood store. Farmers who once sold maize for pennies now delivered directly to African markets, earning in days what they used to earn in months. Street vendors who once struggled for space now ran kiosks inside gleaming African malls. The empire was not for elites, it was for the people. What stunned the world most was not just that. Built Africa's largest retail chain, it was that he built it without selling Africa's dignity. Walmart came with $1 billion. Carrefour came with promises of modernization. Amazon came with offers of technology transfer. But, said no, he said, Africa is not for sale. Africa will build for Africa. Africa will rise for Africa. And because of that refusal, today, Africa is not just a consumer in the global economy, it is a producer, a distributor, a controller of its own destiny. Now let us speak of legacy. 20 years from now, when historians look back, they will not remember Walmart's offer. They will not remember the insults hurled by Western economists. They will not remember the sanctions or the doubts. They will remember that at a decisive moment, one African leader, Captain Ibrahim, looked at $1 billion check and saw chains, looked at promises of partnership and saw dependency, looked at the West's smirk and answered with Africa's roar. And they will remember the people who carried that roar forward, farmers, traders, workers, mothers, fathers, and youth who said, "Never again shall Africa sell its soul for silver." Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the end of the story. The empire continues to expand, not only in Africa but across the global south. Already, branches exist in Caracas, in Havana, in Karachi, in Jakarta. For this empire is not just African, it is a new model for every people who have suffered under economic imperialism. And so, as I conclude tonight, I leave you with this truth. Ibrahim refused $1 billion because he understood that the true wealth of a people cannot be measured in dollars. The true wealth is dignity, sovereignty, and unity. He built Africa's largest retail empire not to boast, not to compete, but to prove that Africa can stand tall, trade fairly, and serve its people with pride. Let this story ignite in us the fire of ownership. Let it remind us that no foreign check, no foreign chain, no foreign corporation can define our destiny. Let it inspire young Africans that dreams are not for sale, that vision is stronger than money, and that when we stand together, we are unstoppable. Tonight, we celebrate not just an empire, but a revolution. A revolution of shelves filled with African goods. A revolution of wallets filled with African earnings. A revolution of hearts filled with African pride. And to the world we say, Africa is awake. Africa is aware. Africa is advancing, and Africa under leaders like Ibrahim will never again be bought. This, my brothers and sisters, is the victory of a continent reborn. This is the power of refusal. This is the triumph of Africa.